I'm Nellie Jones, and welcome to a crash course on Nella Larsen, a famous novelist during the Harlem Renaissance. Nella Larsen was born on April 13, 1891, and she died March 30, 1964. As a young woman, she first started working as a librarian and a nurse. During this time, she published two novels, Quicksand and In Passing, along with 8 other short stories. Once issues of racial and sexual identity have been studied, Larsen's work had been the subject of numerous academic studies. Which bring us back to why she's important during the Harlem Age, because her books dealt with the serious topic of sexual and racial identity. Following is a passage from her second novel, Passing. How such an attitude towards danger as she was sure the letter's contents would reveal, and she disliked the idea of opening and reading it. This, she reflected, was a piece with all that she knew of Claire Kendry. Stepping always on the edge of danger, always aware, but not drawing back or turning aside, certainly not because any of the alarms a feeling of outrage on the part of others.
Or I guess my second point is I want to address the nature and trajectory of this text itself. Passing emerges at the tail end of the 1920s, 1929. And if you remember anything about your American history, and I'm sure there are historians in the room, October 29th, 1929 is when the stock market crashes and we get the beginnings of the Great Depression. In some ways, the novel Passing emerges at the beginning of the end of the Harlem Renaissance because the economic downturn that impacted Americans across races and classes impacted African Americans particularly severely. And so one of the reasons we see the Harlem Renaissance begin to taper off by the middle of the 30s is those economic concerns and that economic struggle really began to, the funding for art and for literature began to really dry up, and it hit African American writers and artists and dancers and intellectuals harder than the white mainstream of the 20s and 30s. And so this is when this novel emerges. If you've read this novel, then you've probably realized by the 4th chapter of part 2 that this book is less about racial passing than is suggested by its title. And it's more of a domestic drama. And so this is when we have to think about Nella Larsen herself as a writer. And there's a great photo of Nella Larsen. Very interesting woman of Dutch and she's one Dutch parent, one parent of African descent. Nella Larsen was very aware of the cultural context of her time and of the fascination of the broader reading audience with the idea of passing. You know, this is something that had been so interesting, captured the American imagination. It still does. But you can imagine the 1920s. And so she called her novel Passing. And her novel is about passing. And she writes about a woman who's passing, especially in that first section of the book, part 1. But by the time we get to part 2, as I said, you start to realize that this is a novel about passing, yes. But it's not so much about the protagonist's old child friend and the fact that Claire, her childhood friend, who passes for white in the white world, is a black woman whose husband doesn't even realize she's black. It's less about that, although that is a great fertile area for plot. And it's more about how Irene is passing. And you may think, well, Irene's not passing. Irene is in black society. Her husband is a black physician. She's one of the society ladies who's respected for having the right husband, the right children. But Irene is passing, we see by the end of part 2 of this novel, and it's divided into 3 parts, that she's passing for someone who's in a loving, secure marriage and in a stable household. That's what she's passing as within her black community. And so although Passing gets readers to pick up the book, the title Passing, and if anyone knows anything about Nella Larsen, and if readers of the time knew that this is the same woman who wrote Quicksand, and she is a mixed race person, and she's gonna write about passing, this is gonna be hot stuff about race. And of course, whenever we talk about passing, particularly racial passing from an African American and white, in that context, especially in the 20s and earlier, there's that idea of it's also about sex. It's also about someone's ancestors, maybe during the slavery period of slavery, having sex, black and white people And so people were really excited about reading Passing, because there's that illicit nature, that illicit underpinning. There is nothing really illicit about multi-ethnic identity. But from the context of the 1920s reader, Passing, that title would just make people want to pull it off the shelf. And so she names it Passing, and it's about passing, but then she flips the script on us, and we see that it's about Irene, and Irene passing as something that she's not. Now, what's interesting to me about this novel is the whole idea. When we start the novel, the idea that Claire is passing in her marriage is a fascinating, the audacity of it. And is married to someone who doesn't like black people, which is one of the great ironies. There's a lot of irony in this book. One of the concerns that readers have, I know I do as a reader, when I'm reading about what Claire is doing, is I'm concerned that her life could be at risk, either because of a literal endangerment to her condition of being alive, or the life as she knows it. She could lose her child. She could be completely isolated from everything she knows in her life in her marriage. We're worried about that. But by the time we get to, we see that passing, and this is something that's familiar for passing stories, that passing can be life or death for the person who is moving about in the white world, but is a person of African descent. But what we also see, by the time we get to the end of the second section, which focuses more on Irene and her husband and her children, is that Irene's passing also can be a life or death situation.